The big question that most Africans really don't want to talk about and for which lots of debates have taken place is, were Africans involved in the transatlantic slave trade? Were they involved in the sales of their brothers and sisters from Africa? Let's find out, together. The answer is a yes. In fact, they were not just involved passively, some of them carried out the sale both as captors of slaves through inter-community raids, were involved as distributors of slaves, as middlemen between the slave traders and the Europeans, as slave dealers, and even as filthy rich slave merchants who were also community chiefs. And we cannot run away from this truth. However, I must be clear that this was not the only way that Europeans used to get Africans who were captured and taken as slaves. But the scope of this video will not cover all that. Also, I want to be very clear that slaves were not taken from Africa, but Africans who had families, brothers, and sisters and who lived in their African communities were captured and sold into slavery. Let's be very clear on that too. I am aware that this is a very sensitive topic to talk about, but nonetheless, we will talk about it, not just from the era of the days of the transatlantic slave trade, but how slavery is manifesting right now in our day, but cloaked in many fine names and theories. There is a lot of evidence to back up the fact that Africans sold Africans as slaves in the era of the slave trade, but I want to keep this video as short as possible and also intentionally tilted towards the modern-day slavery that is happening under our very modern noses, and a little bit away from the ancient slavery that took place. That way, we are not dwelling too much on the past, but doing what we need to correct the present and by that create a better future. Slavery in Africa did not begin with the coming of what you will call the white man or Europeans to Africa, neither did seaports along the coasts of Africa suddenly appear from nowhere because Europeans wanted to come and buy slaves. No. Seaports have always been in coastal African cities and kingdoms for centuries before Europeans came here. They were used for trade between ancient Africans and far lands of Spain, China, India, the Persian Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, and even among other African cities and kingdoms. Africans traded in salt, gold, ivory, tobacco, exotic animals, and many other commodities. Same way, some form of slavery was in Africa long before the Europeans came here, but was called domestic slavery. In this form of slavery, victims of inter-tribal wars, criminals, unwanted people of the communities etc. were sold as slaves to rich people in their communities as farm laborers. They were sold to the kings and rulers of the land, and some were even exported, especially in coastal cities and kingdoms. So, slavery was always here in Africa and in all parts of the world. And that is a proven fact. However, domestic slavery in Africa took a different turn from what it was and became a massive, devastating international monster when Europeans came into Africa. And this also is a fact. I want to share two examples that give clear evidence that Africans sold slaves in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. The story of Badagry slave town in Lagos, Nigeria. Badagry is an ancient town in Nigeria with an interesting past and a significant present. The small coastal town and lagoon port is one of the most important towns in the colonial history of Nigeria and Africa and is close to 593 years old. The town was originally established around 1425 AD by the indigenes of the land. As the second largest commercial town in Lagos State, Badagry developed through the expansion of the settlements of the indigenous people along the coast of Barafew Island. Around 1736, a notable transaction that changed the town from a peaceful settlement into a slave port is said to be the innocent welcome of a Dutch trader who settled in a nearby town from the west of Nigeria. The Dutch settler mixed well with the people and was given a small piece of land to farm. He was locally known as Jovo Huntakanu but would later be identified as Hendrik Hertog. Hertog would later acquire the land and take ownership of it in a way that betrayed the people who initially thought that he was one of them. After acquiring the land, the Dutch trader transformed the town into a trade center which brought more Europeans into the land. The Portuguese and Brazilians had settled on the land after a while, and this opened the gates for the extensive slave trade in the area. The peak period of the slave trade in Badagry was between 1736 and 1789 and was dominated by Portuguese and Brazilian traders. Africans were captured, sold into slavery and transported from West Africa through Badagry. And by 1787, more than 550,000 African slaves were transported to Europe, South America, and the Caribbean. After a while, trading slaves became a major income source for the Europeans in Badagry and the local chiefs. One of the African families that enjoyed the proceeds of the slave trade in Badagry was the Mobi family. Olusegun Mobi, a descendant of one of the slave traders, in his book titled History of the Mobi Family of Badagry and Their Involvement in the Slave Trade, stated this, and I quote, "Slaves were never captured in Badagry. As a matter of fact, then, slavery was a recognized institution all over the world. Slaves were employed by kings, chiefs, and wealthy people in their houses as domestic servants. A man's economic and social status were assessed by the number of slaves he possessed. This type of slavery was known as domestic slavery. Usually, many of these slaves were captives of war. But many of the slave owners, on learning that European slave merchants were besieging Badagry with goods such as iron bars, cotton, wool, linen, whiskey, gin, metal wares, and assorted wines in exchange for slaves, wasted no time to bring their domestic slaves to Badagry with the hope of exchanging them for the listed items. It was confessed that the prospects of transatlantic slave trade fueled into tribal wars in Yorubaland as the kings and slaves who had taken part of the European slave merchants' offer went all out to wage war on the other towns and villages with the sole aim of getting slaves to be exchanged for wine and guns. Today, Badagry is a major tourist center in Lagos, Nigeria. Here is another example, coincidentally also from Nigeria. In an article titled, "My Nigerian Great-Grandfather Sold Slaves," published on BBC News website, Nigerian journalist and novelist Adeobi Trisha Nwabani writes that one of her ancestors sold slaves, but argues that he should not be judged by today's standards or values. She wrote, and I quote, "My great-grandfather, Nwabani Agago Oriaku, was what I prefer to call a businessman, from the Igbo ethnic group of southeastern Nigeria. He dealt in a number of goods, including tobacco and palm produce. He also sold human beings. He had agents who captured slaves from different places and brought them to him, my father told me. Nwabani Agago's slaves were sold through the ports of Calabar and Bani in the south of what is today known as Nigeria. People from ethnic groups along the coast, such as the Efik and Ijaw, usually acted as stevedores for the white merchants and as middlemen for Igbo traders like my great-grandfather. They loaded and offloaded ships and supplied the foreigners with food and other provisions. They negotiated prices for slaves from the hinterlands, then collected royalties from both the sellers and buyers. About 1.5 million Igbo slaves were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean between the 15th and 19th centuries. More than 1.5 million Africans were shipped to what was then called the New World, the Americas, through the Calabar port in the Bight of Bonny, making it one of the largest points of exit during the transatlantic trade. Buying and selling of human beings among the Igbo had been going on long before the Europeans arrived. People became slaves as punishment for crime, payment for debts, or prisoners of war. Igbo slaves served as domestic servants and laborers. They were sometimes also sacrificed in religious ceremonies and buried alive with their masters to attend to them in the next world. The arrival of European merchants offering guns, mirrors, gin, and other exotic goods in exchange for humans massively increased demand, leading people to kidnap others and sell them. End of quote. Frankly speaking, for the sake of truth and justice, and if we want healing to take place in Africa, we must own up to the atrocities we as Africans also committed in the era of the slave trade. Let's face it, it was not possible for Europeans to come into the hinterland of Africa from the coast where their ships were docked, without the help of locals who either helped them out of the goodwill of their hearts towards strangers, or out of ignorance of the true intents of the Europeans, or for their own selfish and greedy reasons. Now, if you look around you, you will see that it's the same thing happening right now even in present-day Africa. Much has not changed. Africa's natural resources or even human resources cannot be exploited by America, Europe, or anyone else without the cohorts of African leaders, governments, government agencies, and private business owners who are seeking self-gain. They may call it trade or business, but we know they are mostly exploitative. Therefore, let me be very direct with you. I mean you that is selling drugs in your black neighborhood somewhere in the US or anywhere else in Africa. What do you think you are doing? When you sell drugs in your community on the streets of SA, Nairobi or Lagos or anywhere else in Africa, you destroy your own people's lives. You destroy their physical and mental health, break their spirituality, and render them slaves of their own addictions. Yes, everyone has a personal choice to make concerning drug use, and it's also true that demand always drives supply. But we must look into all these slave systems that we have created in our communities and begin to make changes before it's too late. What about you, Mr. Pastor and Mrs. Bishop? You tell your church members that Scripture no longer requires the males to be circumcised, and it's true that the Scriptures said so, but how come you don't tell them that tithe is also not compulsory in the New Testament, except if you're led by the Spirit to do it? Are both laws not from the Old Testament? And is that not slavery you are putting your people into? You tell them that if they leave your church that grace will no longer work for them. The last time I checked, it is the grace of the Lord and not your personal property. To you, Mr. President of whatever country in Africa, how is it that whenever IMF and the World Bank cough and sneeze towards your country, you introduce a new tax regime that puts heavier tax chains around the necks of your people? You take loans to do useless things even in the midst of plenty of natural resources in your country. Or are you not aware that the debtor is always a slave of the creditor? To you, African business people or even local street traders, when you make up to 200% or more profit from the sale of your goods, making life difficult for your brothers and sisters because you made your commodities more expensive, what do you think that is? That is the chain of slavery around your people's neck, even if you call it business. We have to change that. And you foreign jobs agencies in Africa, you send our women and young girls to the UAE, Europe, and other parts of the world to work. You seize their travel documents and then abandon them in the hands of vicious and wicked employers who turn them into sex slaves and punching bags. Is that not slavery you are subjecting your people to? Are you not a slave trader? What about you kidnappers and human traffickers? You do all you do for money and greed for the fine things of life. Are you not aware that you are a slave trader? And the list of our modern slavery in Africa is very long, and we need to start to take responsibility for all of our actions, deal with corruption in our countries, and make a better Africa for all of us. To be very frank with you, it's not the transatlantic slave trade of 500 years ago that worries me, but the modern-day slavery that we are subjecting our people to, and then we behave like we are not aware of it. For if in 2030 about 42% of young people globally will be African youths, and many of these youths are busy now doing comedy skits, dancing and wasting life on TikTok, is that not the slavery of a generation that we have already created by our inactions and inability to see that it's time we come together in unity and deal with the rottenness in our societies? We need to raise and train more young people who are nation builders in their thinking, business owners in their minds, innovators, and not just graduates seeking jobs where there are no jobs. The global system is closing in on everything African, so Africans in the continent, Africans in the diaspora, people of African descent and true friends of Africa need to come together to build what we want to see in Africa. No one is coming to help Africa, and until we all come together to make changes, we will keep talking and blaming others and nothing will change. Thank you for watching. Please like and share this video. Also, subscribe to this channel.